The night stretched cold and long over the Wyoming plains, the kind of night where the wind carried every sorrow across miles of emptiness. Inside a small cabin tucked against the edge of the Ward Ranch, the air was filled with the sharp, desperate cry of a baby who didn't understand the weight of grief pressing down on the man who held her. Eli Ward rocked back and forth beside the flickering fire, his shirt half-buttoned, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The baby in his arms, little Clara, was barely 3 weeks old. 3 weeks since she'd entered the world, and 3 weeks since her mother had left it. His wife, Lydia, had gone silent in the same bed where Clara now slept. The midwife had whispered apologies that night, but Eli couldn't remember her words. Only the sound of the baby's first cry, sweet and cruel at once, had burned itself into his heart. He had thought he could manage. He was a rancher, a man who'd tamed wild horses and driven cattle through blizzards. He could fix a roof, break a bronc, and fight off a coyote. But nothing in his rough, practical world had prepared him for this tiny life depending on him. Clara's cries pierced the cabin walls like shards of glass. Eli tried everything he knew, or thought he knew. He warmed some milk from the barn cow, but she refused it. He rocked her, walked her, whispered broken prayers that he hadn't said in years. Still, the baby screamed, her little fists trembling in the air. The ranch hands were long asleep in the bunkhouse, too afraid or too respectful to offer help. They'd watched their boss lose his wife and retreat into silence. The ranch, once lively with Lydia's laughter, had turned hollow, just the sound of wind against the barn and that endless, aching cry. Eli's throat tightened as he looked down at his daughter. Her face was red from wailing, her tiny mouth quivering. He'd never felt so helpless. "Please," he whispered hoarsely. "Just stop crying, sweetheart. I don't know what you need." His voice cracked at the end, a sound foreign to his own ears. Outside, the snow had started falling lightly. The window panes rattled with each gust, and the oil lamp burned low. Eli sank into the old rocking chair Lydia used to mend clothes in, remembering how she would hum to her belly before the baby was born. He tried humming too, awkward and low. It didn't help. By the time the fire burned down to embers, Eli's arms were trembling from exhaustion. He placed Clara in her cradle, but her crying only grew louder, sharp and desperate. He covered his face with his hands. "God help me," he muttered. "I can't do this alone." And somewhere beyond the fence line, someone heard him, or at least heard the baby. In the small house across the pasture, Mary Ellen Hayes sat up in bed, her heart aching with each cry that carried through the wind. She knew that sound. It was the sound of hunger, of need. Her aunt snored softly in the next room, but Mary couldn't rest. The poor man, Mr. Ward, had lost his wife not even a month ago. Everyone in town pitied him, whispered about how he'd manage with an infant. Mary's hands clenched in her lap. She had goat's milk still warm from the evening milking. It could help. But propriety tugged at her. What would people say about a young, unmarried woman knocking on a widower's door in the middle of the night? She bit her lip, torn between fear and compassion. Then another cry broke the silence, sharper, more desperate than before, and something inside Mary moved. She pulled her shawl tight, wrapped the bottle in cloth, and stepped into the cold. Across the dark field, one lantern burned weakly in Eli Ward's cabin. The cries echoed still, guiding her through the snow, and though neither of them knew it yet, that small act, one woman walking toward another's sorrow, was the first step toward healing both their hearts. Mary Ellen Hayes stood at the edge of her porch, the chill night pressing against her cheeks as the wind carried that haunting cry again. The cry of a baby who hadn't known a moment's peace since her mother's death. It drifted from the Ward Ranch half a mile away, a thin, aching sound that reached right into Mary's chest and refused to let go. She'd heard it for 3 nights straight. Each time she'd lain awake in her narrow bed, clutching her quilt, whispering to herself that it wasn't her place. Eli Ward was a proud man. Everyone in town said so. He was also grieving, and grief made men unpredictable. A woman had no business knocking on a widower's door after dark. The neighbors would talk. They always did. But tonight the baby's cry had changed. It wasn't just fussing anymore. It was raw, gasping need. Mary closed her eyes and saw the image clear as day. A worn-out man pacing his floor, helpless arms trying to calm a child too young to understand why her mother no longer came. She swallowed hard. In the small lean-to that served as her aunt's pantry, a half-full bottle of fresh goat's milk sat cooling in a pan of water. The nanny goat had kidded early that year, and Mary had been saving the milk for baking in the morning. But what was bread compared to a hungry baby? Her aunt, Mrs. Greeley, would call it foolish. No sense meddling in a man's affairs, she'd say. But Mrs. Greeley was asleep, and Mary couldn't bear another minute of that sound. Her hands trembled as she poured the milk into a clean bottle, wrapped it in a scrap of linen, and tied her faded shawl over her head. The lantern by the door sputtered to life, throwing long shadows across the yard. The path between the two homesteads cut through open pasture, the snow crunching beneath her boots. Each gust of wind tugged at her skirt, stinging her eyes, but she pressed on. The lantern light swung with her steps, a small, brave glow in the dark. Mary was not bold by nature. She'd spent most of her 22 years hiding behind her aunt's skirts, avoiding the rough talk of ranch hands and the sharp tongues of town wives. Yet something about that baby's helpless cry stripped her of hesitation. When she reached the ward gate, the noise was louder, piercing through the cabin walls. She hesitated, heart pounding. What would she even say? "I heard your baby crying and thought you might need milk." The words sounded foolish, but doing nothing felt worse. Mary raised her hand and knocked. No answer. She knocked again, louder. At last the door opened, and there stood Eli Ward, broad-shouldered, eyes sunken from sleeplessness, a child wailing in the crook of his arm. He looked startled, almost wild, until his gaze fell on her shy face. "Miss Hayes?" he rasped. "It's near midnight. What's wrong?" Mary swallowed, clutching the wrapped bottle like a shield. It ain't me, Mr. Ward, it's her." "The baby," she gestured nervously. "She sounds hungry. I brought milk, goat's milk. It might help." For a heartbeat he only stared, pride and weariness warring in his expression. Then Clara let out another piercing cry, and something in his rigid stance broke. He stepped aside silently. "Come in." The cabin smelled of smoke and exhaustion. Mary set the bottle near the hearth, warmed it carefully, then offered it to him. "Hold her like this," she murmured, guiding his rough hands into a gentler cradle. When the baby finally latched and began to drink, the room filled with the softest sound, contented sucking, a sigh, then quiet. Eli's shoulders sagged with relief. For the first time in weeks, there was peace. He looked up at Mary, his voice rough. "Thank you." "I didn't know what to do." Mary's lips curved in a small, uncertain smile. "No one does at first." Outside, the wind still howled, but inside the tiny cabin, calm settled like a blanket. Mary had meant only to help for a moment, yet as she watched the big rancher's hardened face soften toward his child, she felt something change within her too, a warmth that would not easily fade. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a long moment the only sound in Eli Ward's cabin was the tiny rhythmic suckling of his daughter. The change was so sudden, so absolute, that it took him several seconds to realize the crying had stopped. The storm outside rattled the window panes, but inside, peace had finally descended, fragile and deep. Eli stared at the baby in his arms, still half afraid to breathe. Her little face was soft and flushed now, her eyes fluttering as she drank from the bottle. For 3 endless weeks, he had done everything wrong, too cold, too hot, too fast, too slow. Yet this quiet, shy neighbor girl had walked in and, in the span of minutes, done what he could not. Across from him, Mary stood near the hearth, fingers twisting the edge of her shawl, unsure if she should stay or go. The flickering firelight painted her face in soft gold. She was not a woman who drew the eye easily, her clothes plain, her hair tucked in a simple braid. But there was something about her calm, steady presence that made the cabin feel alive again. Eli cleared his throat. "How'd you know what to do?" Mary hesitated, glancing at him shyly. "My aunt keeps goats. I've helped her raise a few orphans before. They cry the same way when they're hungry." Her voice carried a tremor of humility, as if she were apologizing for knowing more than he did. He almost smiled. Never figured I'd be compared to a goat. The corner of her mouth twitched. Well, babies don't much care who feeds them, sir. Only that someone does. He looked down at Clara again, feeling a lump rise in his throat. Lydia had once said nearly the same thing, teasing him when he'd been too proud to accept help. He blinked hard and focused on the tiny fingers gripping his thumb. She's quiet now, he murmured, almost in disbelief. Mary nodded. She'll sleep soon. She just needed something warm in her belly. Her tone was so sure, so gently confident, that he found himself trusting her instantly. The silence between them stretched, filled not with awkwardness, but with a strange, tentative comfort. It had been so long since anyone else had stood in this cabin and spoken softly without pity. Mary gathered her shawl tighter. I should go. My aunt'll be wondering. Eli looked up quickly, the words catching before he could stop them. You don't have to leave yet. It's snowing harder. I can make coffee. The invitation surprised even him. He hadn't shared coffee with anyone since Lydia's funeral, but the thought of her stepping back into the cold alone felt wrong. Mary hesitated, torn between politeness and propriety. Then the wind howled against the door, making the decision for her. She nodded. Just for a moment, then, Eli busied himself at the stove, grateful for the distraction. He found 2 chipped mugs and poured the steaming coffee, the scent filling the room. When he turned, Mary was watching the baby sleep, her expression so tender it made something twist in his chest. She's beautiful, she whispered. She looks like her ma, Eli said softly. Then, realizing what he'd admitted, he cleared his throat again. Thank you for coming over. I didn't know what I'd have done if you hadn't. Mary shook her head. You'd have managed, Mr. Ward. Folks always find a way when they have to. Maybe so, he thought, but he wasn't sure. As she sipped her coffee by the firelight, he found himself noticing the way her lashes caught the glow, the way her hands trembled slightly from cold. When she rose to leave, he wanted to stop her but couldn't find the words. She promised to bring more milk in the morning and slipped out into the snow, leaving behind the faint scent of wood smoke and warmth. Eli stood at the doorway long after she'd gone, listening to the night. The wind still blew, but the cabin no longer felt so empty. For the first time since Lydia's death, he realized someone else had crossed the threshold of his grief. And though the door closed between them, something had quietly opened inside his heart. By morning, the snow had settled thick over the valley, softening every fence post and rooftop beneath a blanket of white. Eli woke to an unfamiliar silence, the kind that followed peace, not sorrow. Clara still slept soundly in her cradle, her tiny fist curled around the edge of her blanket. For the first time in weeks, he hadn't spent the night pacing the floor. He couldn't remember when exhaustion had ever felt this sweet. The smell of yesterday's fire lingered in the air as he poured a cup of bitter coffee and sat at the table, staring at the empty bottle Mary had left behind. He turned it over in his hands, the glass catching the pale light. Her voice echoed in his mind. She just needed something warm in her belly. Simple words, but they'd undone a knot inside him that no amount of ranch work could. He didn't expect her to return. Folks around here were kind enough to offer help once, then let pride and gossip keep them apart after that. But as he stepped outside to feed the horses, he caught sight of her figure moving carefully through the snow, shawl drawn close, cheeks pink from cold, a small basket in her hands. She hesitated at the gate, her breath clouding in the air. "Good morning, Mr. Ward," she called softly, almost as if unsure he'd welcome her again. "Morning?" he answered, surprised at how easily his mouth curved into something close to a smile. "You came back." "I brought more milk," she said, lifting the basket a little. "And some bread. My aunt baked extra." He stepped aside and opened the door for her. The cabin, though still rough and quiet, seemed brighter with her inside it. The baby stirred at the sound of their voices, then whimpered softly. Mary set down her things and moved toward the cradle without waiting for permission. Her manner gentle, like someone approaching a skittish animal. "She's hungry again, I think," Mary murmured. She warmed the milk on the stove, humming under her breath, the same tune she'd hummed the night before. Eli stood by, awkward and uncertain, watching her as if afraid he might break the fragile rhythm that had found its way into his home. When the baby drank, Mary smiled faintly, pride and affection mingling in her eyes. "There now," she said quietly. "You're getting the hang of it, aren't you?" Eli wasn't sure if she meant him or the baby, but he felt a strange warmth at her words. "You're good with her," he said. "Better than I am, that's certain." Mary ducked her head, embarrassed. "Just practice, that's all." They shared breakfast at the table, the silence between them filled with small, hesitant words. About the weather, about goats and horses, about how long the snow might last. He found himself asking questions just to keep her talking, drawn to the calm in her voice. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, and a soft gold light spilled through the frosted windows. Mary noticed the dust on the mantel, the unwashed dishes in the basin, the tiny shirt hanging half-sewn on a chair. Without a word, she rolled up her sleeves and began to tidy. Eli started to protest. "You don't have to." But she interrupted gently. "It's no trouble. I like things neat." Her hands moved quietly but surely, restoring order to a place that had forgotten what comfort looked like. When she was done, she wiped her palms on her skirt and turned to him. "I'll come by tomorrow if that's all right. Claire'll need more milk." He nodded, unable to find his voice. As she stepped out into the sunlight, he watched her go until the trail of her footprints disappeared into the snow. The cabin felt warm long after she'd gone, as if she'd left a piece of her kindness behind, woven through the air. That night, as Clara slept and the fire crackled low, Eli caught himself glancing at the door, listening for another knock that didn't come. He smiled faintly at the thought, realizing how strange it was to look forward to something so small, a shy neighbor girl's visit. But that was how healing worked, he supposed. Not in grand gestures or miracles, but in quiet acts of mercy, awkward, unexpected, and deeply human. Days folded into one another like pages in a book neither of them meant to write. What began as a single act of kindness became a quiet rhythm, steady, natural, and oddly comforting. Each morning, Mary Ellen Hayes crossed the snowy pasture between her aunt's small house and the Ward Ranch, a basket of warm goat's milk swinging from her arm. By the time she arrived, the sun would just be cresting the distant hills, bathing the land in soft gold. Eli Ward always heard her before he saw her, the crunch of boots in the snow, the creak of the gate, the gentle knock at his door. Each time he'd feel that strange flutter of warmth, half gratitude and half something he didn't dare name. "Morning, Mr. Ward," she'd say, her breath misting in the cold. "Morning, Miss Hayes," he'd answer, his voice rough from disuse but softening a little each day. Inside, they'd fall into their quiet routine. Mary would warm the milk and feed little Clara, humming a tune as the baby cooed and kicked happily. Eli would chop wood, mend tack, or sweep the hearth, anything to keep his hands busy and his heart steady. The ranch, which had once felt haunted by silence, now held gentle noises, a woman's hum, a baby's laughter, the soft clink of dishes as Mary tidied without asking. Sometimes, she stayed to help with simple chores, mending shirts, hanging laundry by the stove, folding tiny blankets that still smelled faintly of Lydia's lavender soap. Eli noticed she never asked about his late wife, never pried or offered pity. She just filled the empty spaces with quiet grace, like sunlight slipping through the cracks, and in that stillness, Eli began to breathe again. At first, he tried to pay her. "For the milk," he'd said gruffly, setting a few coins on the table. Mary's face flushed pink, and she shook her head. "I'm not doing this for money, Mr. Ward." "Then why?" he asked before he could stop himself. Her gaze dropped to the floor. "Because the baby needs someone. And maybe—" She hesitated. "Maybe I do too." He hadn't known what to say to that. So he'd just nodded, and they'd gone on as before. Over the next few weeks, the snow melted and the land softened. The ranch hands began to notice their boss changing. Eli laughed more, spoke more, even joined them for supper once or twice. They whispered among themselves about the shy neighbor girl, though none dared speak of it to him directly. One afternoon, Eli found himself watching Mary as she rocked Clara near the window. Sunlight touched her hair, turning it to strands of gold, and the sound of her laughter, soft and unguarded, filled the room. Something stirred deep in his chest, something he thought had died with Lydia. He didn't understand it, and that frightened him. That evening, after she left, he stood at the doorway, looking across the fading light toward her small house in the distance. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about loss. He was thinking about possibility. Mary, meanwhile, returned home to her aunt's scolding tongue and curious glances. Mrs. Greeley had begun to suspect more than milk runs were drawing her niece to the Ward Ranch. "You'll ruin your name, girl," she'd warn. A young widow's no place for a single woman. But Mary only smiled faintly and said, "He's kind and lonely. The baby, too." She didn't say that she was lonely as well, that the ranch had started to feel more like home than the house she'd grown up in, and so the days continued, gentle and unspoken, the kind of days that stitched two wounded souls together without either realizing it. For Eli, Mary's visits became the heartbeat of his mornings. For Mary, his gratitude and quiet respect became a kind of safety she'd never known. Neither of them said it aloud, but the truth was simple. What began as charity had become companionship. And what felt like routine was slowly, quietly becoming love. By the time spring arrived, the Ward Ranch looked alive again. The fences were mended, the barns freshly painted, and laughter, small and hesitant, could sometimes be heard from the cabin. Mary's daily visits had become as natural as the sunrise. She came with milk, bread, and quiet cheer. She stayed to rock the baby and share a simple meal. But in a small town, nothing went unseen, and certainly nothing went unspoken. It started with whispers at the general store. Someone mentioned seeing Mary walking home from the Ward place after dusk. Another said she'd been there every day through the winter. By the next week, the story had grown legs. The shy neighbor girl was setting her cap for the widower. Mary heard the rumors first while buying flour. Mrs. Pike, the butcher's wife, leaned over the counter with a knowing smile. "You must be keeping busy helping Mr. Ward, dear. Such devotion's bound to turn a man's head." Her cheeks burned hot. "It's not like that, ma'am. The baby needed milk, that's all," Mrs. Pike chuckled, her tone full of syrup and sting. "Oh, of course. But people do talk, you know." By the time Mary returned home, her stomach was tied in knots. She told herself gossip was harmless, just noise carried by the wind, but gossip in a small town stuck like burrs. That evening, her aunt cornered her at supper. "Mary Ellen Hayes," Mrs. Greeley said sharply, "what business have you got being at that man's place every day? Folks are starting to think you're throwing yourself at him." Mary's spoon clattered against the bowl. "Auntie, I'm only helping. The poor man lost his wife. That's no concern of yours. A decent girl minds her reputation. You keep this up, and no respectable man will look at you twice." Mary's throat closed. The words hit harder than her aunt intended because they echoed Mary's own secret fear. She had grown too attached to the baby's smile, to the sound of Eli's voice softening when he spoke her name. Maybe people were right to talk. Maybe she was foolish to care. That night, Mary lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the wind rustled the budding trees, but all she could hear was the echo of the town's whispers. She imagined the looks, the laughter behind her back. Her aunt was right. One careless rumor could ruin her. The next morning, she didn't go to the Ward Ranch. For the first time in months, Eli waited by the door and saw only empty snow-melted fields. At first, he thought she might be ill. By afternoon, he saddled his horse and rode to her place. Baby Clara bundled against his chest. Mary met him on the porch, her face pale but set with quiet resolve. "Miss Hayes," he said, confused and out of breath. "I was worried. You didn't come." She folded her arms tightly. "I can't, Mr. Ward, not anymore. People are saying things about me, about you. It's not right." Eli's jaw tightened. "You're letting gossip keep you from helping a child?" "It's not just gossip," she whispered. "It's my good name. My aunt's. I can't ruin what little we have." For a long moment, neither spoke. The baby stirred, whimpering softly. Mary reached out instinctively, then caught herself and pulled her hand back. Eli's voice dropped low. "You think I care what folks say? You think I'd let a few wagging tongues drive away the one person who's kept this house standing?" Her eyes shone with tears, but she shook her head. "You don't understand, Mr. Ward. You already lost a wife. I can't lose my place in this town. Please, just don't come back." He wanted to argue, to shout, but something in her trembling voice stopped him. Instead, he nodded once, curtly, and turned away. As he rode home, the wind carried the faint cries of his daughter. They sounded lonelier than before. That night, Eli sat by the empty hearth, staring at the cold bottle in his hands. The cabin felt hollow again, as if all the warmth Mary had brought had vanished with her. And across the pasture, in her small room, Mary pressed her face into her pillow, praying for the courage to do what her heart couldn't bear, stay away from the man and the child who had quietly become her whole world. The days after Mary's departure stretched long and gray across the Ward ranch. The laughter that had once drifted from the cabin vanished, replaced again by the hollow quiet Eli had thought he'd escaped. Clara cried more often now, unsettled and restless. The bottle that once soothed her sat cold on the table, no longer filled with Mary's warm goat's milk, no longer offered with a steady humming voice. Eli tried to manage, but the silence pressed heavy against his chest. The ranch hands noticed his temper shorten, his eyes darken. He worked harder, longer, as if he could bury the ache beneath chores. But every night as he rocked his crying daughter, his mind drifted to the image of a girl standing on a porch, her eyes full of tears she hadn't let fall. On the fourth day, he couldn't take it anymore. The rumors didn't matter. Pride didn't matter. Clara needed Mary, and, he admitted grimly, so did he. That morning, he saddled his horse and rode into town, the cold wind biting at his face. The general store buzzed with the usual chatter, but the conversations quieted when he stepped through the door. Eli Ward was not a man given to small talk, and today his expression made it clear he had no patience for it. Mrs. Pike glanced up from the counter, her smile tight and curious. "Why, Mr. Ward, what brings you to town? Everything all right out at the ranch?" "Where's Miss Hayes?" he asked flatly, her eyebrows shot up. "Mary Ellen? Well, she's over at the market, I believe." But he didn't wait for her to finish. The door swung shut behind him as he strode down the dusty street, ignoring the stares that followed. Mary stood by the vegetable stall, her shawl pulled close, head bent as she counted coins into the shopkeeper's palm. The moment she looked up and saw him, her breath caught. The market square fell quiet around them. "Mr. Ward," she began, her voice low, "you shouldn't be here." He stopped a few steps away, his hat in his hand. "You left without saying goodbye." "I told you it wasn't proper," she said, eyes flicking nervously toward the bystanders. "People are still talking. I've heard," he replied evenly. "I've also heard enough talk in my life to know it don't feed a baby." She flinched at that, guilt flashing in her eyes. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." Eli took a breath, fighting to keep his tone calm. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need you to know Clara won't eat proper without you. She cries all night. I can't soothe her, not the way you do." Mary shook her head, her hands twisting in her shawl. "She'll get used to it." "Babies always do." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Maybe. But I won't. This cabin, my life, it all went dark again when you stopped coming." The words hung between them, heavy and dangerous. Mary's throat tightened. "Mr. Ward, please. Folks are watching. Let them." His voice softened then. No anger left. Just a quiet ache. "They can say what they like. I don't care. You saved us once, Mary. I don't think I can manage losing that peace again." Her eyes shimmered with tears she couldn't hide. The raw sincerity in his voice undid her. For months, she'd thought her kindness was small and unnoticed. But now, hearing the tremor in his words, she realized it had meant everything. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. "Someone might misunderstand." He gave a faint, sad smile. "Then let him. I mean every word plain." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the shopkeeper cleared his throat behind them, and the spell broke. Mary looked down, flustered. "I can't come every day." "Not like before." "I'm not asking for that," Eli said. "Just come back." "Come see Clara. She misses you." Mary's heart tugged painfully. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "Tomorrow morning," she said softly. "I'll bring milk," Eli exhaled, relief washing over his face. "Thank you, Mary." As he turned to leave, she called after him, her voice trembling. "Mr. Ward!" He looked back. "Don't listen to them," she said. "People talk about what they don't understand." He gave a small nod. "Ain't that the truth?" When he rode away, Mary stood in the middle of the square, her pulse racing. She knew the whispers would only grow louder, but so would something else. Something she'd tried hard to silence, and this time, she wasn't sure she wanted to. The next morning dawned golden over the prairie, the air crisp and clean after a night of rain. Eli was already awake before the rooster crowed, pacing the floor of the cabin. He'd spent the night listening to Clara's soft whimpers, counting down the hours until Mary might return. He told himself it was only for the baby, but the restless way his hands trembled as he fixed his collar said otherwise. When he finally saw her walking up the path, a small bundle of bottles in her arms, something in his chest unclenched. She looked the same, modest shawl, soft hair pinned neatly, but there was a careful hesitation in her steps, as though she wasn't sure if she was welcome. Eli stepped onto the porch and met her halfway. "Morning." "Miss Hayes," he said quietly. She smiled, though her eyes darted away. "Morning, Mr. Ward. I brought the milk. Fresh from this morning." "Clara'll be glad," he said and opened the door. Inside, the cabin felt both familiar and awkward. Mary moved with gentle purpose, setting her things down and checking the fire. Eli watched her, feeling as if warmth had returned to the place with her. When she finally took Clara in her arms, the baby quieted at once, her cries softening into contented hums. Eli exhaled. "She remembers you." Mary looked down at the child and smiled faintly. "Babies remember kindness," she said. He nodded. "Then she's got good sense." They shared a quiet laugh. It wasn't much, but it loosened the air between them. Over the following days, Mary began visiting again, not every day, but enough that the ranch started to feel alive once more. She'd hum as she worked, her voice blending with the soft crackle of the hearth. Eli found himself listening for that sound when he came in from the fields. It steadied him more than whiskey ever could. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, Mary watched him too. She noticed the gentleness beneath his roughness, the way he carried Clara as though she were made of glass, or how he'd fixed the broken latch on her milk pail without being asked. He wasn't a man of many words, but his silence held care. One evening, after supper, Clara was already asleep when the wind outside began to howl. The storm rolled over the plains fast, and rain lashed against the windows. Mary started to gather her shawl, but Eli stopped her. "You'll be soaked through before you reach home," he said. "Stay till it passes." She hesitated. "It wouldn't be right." "I'll sleep in the barn," he replied. "No harm in that. Just don't risk the storm." Her protest softened under his steady gaze. She nodded slowly. "All right, just till it lightens." He built up the fire while she sat near it, drying her skirt. For a while, the only sound was the crackle of flames and rain drumming on the roof. "You ever dance, Miss Hayes?" Eli asked suddenly. She blinked, startled. "Dance?" He smiled slightly, eyes glinting in the firelight. "Figured you might have once upon a time." She shook her head. "No, sir. My pa didn't hold with such things." "Mine either," he said, rising to his feet. "Guess we're both overdue." She laughed softly, the sound a mix of disbelief and amusement. "You can't be serious." He held out his hand. "Come on. Ain't no music but the rain, but it'll do." For a moment she hesitated, but then she placed her hand in his. His touch was warm, steady, careful. They moved slowly across the small room, awkward at first, then easier as they found a rhythm in the storm's patter. The firelight flickered over them, her cheeks flushed pink, his eyes softened with something unspoken. It wasn't a dance of romance, not yet. It was something gentler, two lonely souls remembering what warmth felt like. When the thunder quieted, They stood still, hands lingering for a heartbeat too long before she stepped back. Breath unsteady. "Thank you," she whispered. Unsure what she was thanking him for. The dance, the kindness, or the way he made her feel seen. Eli nodded once. "You're welcome, Mary." Outside, the rain began to ease. Inside, something had quietly changed. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the plains washed clean under a pale sun. But though the skies had cleared, something heavier hung in the air. Rumors. In a small town like Dawson Creek, a single whisper could gallop faster than any horse. And by the time Mary reached the market that week, the looks she received weren't curious anymore. They were sharp, knowing. Mrs. Pike gave her a pitying smile. Mr. Dobbs at the feed store muttered something about a ranch widow and a girl with soft eyes. Mary kept her chin high, her shawl wrapped tight, but her stomach twisted. She knew what they thought, that she'd stayed the night at Eli Ward's ranch for reasons other than a storm. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she had done nothing wrong. But shame, undeserved as it was, clung to her like burrs. When she reached home, she found Eli waiting near the gate, his hat in hand. "I came to thank you," he said, his voice low. "For last night. Clara slept through till morning." Mary looked around nervously. Her father's old neighbor, Mrs. Elkins, was watching from across the yard. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "People are talking," he frowned. "About what?" "About us," she said, the words tasting bitter. "They say things that aren't true. And they'll keep saying them if you keep riding up here." Eli shifted, jaw tightening. "I don't care what they say." "Well, I do." Her voice broke, trembling with frustration. "You don't have to live with their looks." "I do. I go to church with them. I shop beside them. They already think I've overstepped my place just by helping you." The baby in the saddlebag cooed softly, the only sound between them for a long moment. Then Eli said quietly, "And what's your place, Mary?" "Who told you you had to stay where they put you?" Her throat tightened. "The world told me. Life told me." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Then maybe the world's wrong." She turned away before he could see the tears gathering in her eyes. "Please, Mr. Ward, I can't have my name dragged through mud. It's hard enough making my way as it is." Eli hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I understand." He adjusted his hat. "I'll not trouble you anymore." The words struck her like a cold wind, though they were what she'd asked for. As he walked back to his horse, a part of her wanted to call him back, to tell him she didn't mean forever. But her pride held her still. That night, Mary sat by the window, the lamp burning low. She thought of Clara's tiny hands, of the warmth of Eli's arms when they danced. She thought of the way he looked at her, not as charity, not as gossip would claim, but as if she were someone worth seeing. She knew what the right thing was, what safe looked like: silence, obedience, invisibility. But her heart, traitorous and loud, whispered that maybe love wasn't meant to hide. Across town, Eli lay awake by the fire, staring at the flames. The loneliness pressed harder now because it came with memory. He had promised to stay away, but Clara stirred restlessly in her sleep, as though she too felt the loss. He thought of the town's gossip, of how quick folks were to judge what they didn't understand. He'd lived under their scrutiny before after his wife passed. He could live through it again. But Mary, sweet, quiet Mary, didn't deserve that kind of weight. He ran a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. If keeping her safe meant staying away, he would. But a thought lingered, stubborn and bright. Maybe it was time to stop letting other people's voices dictate his life. By dawn, both had made a choice they didn't yet realize matched. Mary, staring at her reflection in the window, whispered, "If I'm to live by kindness, not fear, I'll go where my heart is heard." And Eli, watching the horizon pale with morning light, said softly to the empty room, "I won't let her walk through this alone." Neither knew that by the next sunrise, their paths would cross again, not by accident, but by courage. The morning sun rose soft and golden over Dawson Creek, spreading warmth across the open fields and painting the world in quiet light. It was the kind of day that looked like forgiveness, a day that carried the promise of something new. Mary walked along the familiar dirt road leading to the Ward ranch, her shawl fluttering in the breeze. Her heart pounded with every step. She had spent the night wrestling with fear and longing, torn between what people expected of her and what her heart whispered she truly wanted. In the end, it was Clara's small face that tipped the scales, the thought of the baby's innocent smile, and the memory of her fingers clutching Mary's as if she belonged there. Mary had never truly belonged anywhere before, but in that little cabin, she had felt something close to home. When she reached the ranch, Eli was in the yard splitting wood. His axe came down with measured strength, the rhythmic sound echoing through the still morning. When he looked up and saw her, he froze, his hand still gripping the handle. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Eli set the axe aside and walked toward her, each step careful, uncertain. "Didn't expect to see you," he said softly. "Thought I'd scared you off for good." Mary's eyes met his. "You didn't scare me. You made me think," he nodded, looking down. "I've done too much thinking myself. I figured keeping away was best for you." "But," he paused, his jaw tightening, "I can't keep pretending I don't care, Mary. I can't stand by and let folks' words decide how we live." The wind lifted her hair gently as she stepped closer. "Eli, people will always talk. About you, about me. About anyone who dares to live different." He met her gaze then, raw honesty in his eyes. "And you're ready to live different?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Maybe I already have." He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "You're braver than you think." "I'm just tired of being afraid," she said. "And tired of pretending that what we have, what's between us, don't matter." Eli's throat worked as he tried to speak, but emotion caught the words. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small silver locket. This was Clara's mother's. "I was going to give it to her when she was older. But I think—" He opened it, revealing a tiny engraving of 2 initials intertwined. "I think it ought to go to the woman who's been her mother in all the ways that count." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "Eli," he took her hand gently, his calloused thumb brushing across her skin. "You've given this house warmth again. You've given Clara peace and me, something I thought I buried with my wife." She looked at him, voice trembling. "And what's that?" "Hope." For a moment the world stood still. The rustle of wind through the grass, the distant low of cattle, everything seemed to fade. Mary felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they weren't from sadness. They were from the deep, tender realization that she wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen. Eli reached out and drew her closer, not roughly, but with the quiet reverence of a man who knew the worth of gentleness. "I ain't asking for grand promises," he said. "Just stay. Stay and see what tomorrow looks like with us." She nodded slowly, her voice a whisper. "I think I'd like that." Clara's soft cry came from inside the cabin, breaking the moment. Mary laughed through her tears and slipped from his arms to go to the baby. Eli watched her cradle his daughter, the 2 of them framed in morning light, the image of grace he'd never thought he'd see again. As Mary soothed Clara, Eli stood in the doorway, his heart full. The world outside could keep its gossip. Inside this home there was laughter, life, and the promise of healing. When Mary looked up at him and smiled, he knew that the long, lonely winters of his soul were over. And for the first time in years, Eli Ward whispered to himself, "We're home."